on illegitimate debt and the situation on debt in Asia as part of the Eurodad Debt Wednesday course. The course looks into sovereign debt architecture and its problems. And before we start, let me just remind the presenters to mute their microphones for now. Today we dive into one such issue, the topic of illegitimate debt and debt audits. If you see behind me here, I've put up an old poster from Jubilee South, the Southern debt movement of the 90s and 2000s. And they sum up today's topic in one slogan: don't owe, won't pay. Some debts can be classified as odious or illegitimate based on how they originated. One historic example would be the debts after slavery that was abolished in Haiti, or debts incurred by the apartheid regime in South Africa. Today we will learn more about such claims. And we will learn more about the current debt situation in Asia. First, I mean, we have some housekeeping, of course. This course is organized by the DADs, and the DADs are the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, the AfroDad Network, the Eurodad Network, and the Latin Dad Network, as well as Jubilee USA. All of these organizations work on the topic of debt and development. Our donors are the European Union, Bread for the World, the Open Society Foundation, and Avina Americas. A special thank you also to OSISA for providing the Portuguese translation. And in terms of translation, if you're using it, you have to press the little globe and then you choose your language. The structure of the seminar, we will have introductions from our speakers, and then we will have a Q&A, and you can ask your questions in the question and answer box. And then we can use the chat for more interaction between ourselves and discussion. We will have a coffee break at 4 o'clock before Daniel Jeong-Dae comes and talks about the Asian debt situation. Our panelists are Eric Toussaint from the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt, CADTM. Eric is an academic and activist for many, many years. He's written countless books on this topic, and he is just a trove of information. I really look forward to hearing Eric speak. We also have Iolanda Fresnillo from the European Network on Debt and Development, where she is the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer. Iolanda has also worked for a decade or two on debt issues as an activist and policy analyst from Spain, and now Eurodad. And later we will be joined by Daniel Jeong-Dae, who is an economist with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And he's a researcher into fiscal space, SDG investment, and resilience to shocks, as well as structural transformation, which should also be interesting. So I should mention that the session is recorded, so we all know that now. And I will just, before I kick off Iolanda, I will just ask if Ilaria has any more additional comments to my housekeeping notes.
Thank you very much, Kjetil. No, everything seems fine. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm going to hand us all over to Iolanda Fresnillo on the topic of illegitimate debt and debt audits.
Thank you, Kjetil. It's actually a pleasure to be here with again with you and Eric. As Kjetil was mentioning, we, besides our positions, we've all been activists on the cause of debt cancellation, and especially illegitimate debt cancellation. So I'm really happy to be talking today about debt audits. I'll try to be short so we can have more time to listen to Eric. And I'll just introduce the issue of debt audits. Eurodad is about to publish a briefing presenting some recommendations and bibliography around debt audits. This will be available probably on the email you will receive in the follow-up of this seminar. So even if you get lost at some point, you will get a written input on the issue from us. And my intervention is just going to be a summary of that briefing. Why talk today about debt audits? We will talk more on odious debt and legitimate debt with Eric, but one of the most important and interesting and powerful tools that we have to deal with those illegitimate debts is actually debt audits. And in the wake of this new debt crisis, many civil society groups have increased interest in what's going on in their countries around debt and how can they better understand the situation and challenge the debt accumulation process in their countries. So debt audits can be, as I said, a powerful tool to support civil society engagement in this campaigning against illegitimate debts or against the prioritization of debt payments before any other public expenditure like health, vaccines, education, even economic recovery. We will talk today about citizen debt audits. I will focus more on that, but also a little bit about official debt audits, so audits that can be led by the governments. What is a debt audit? Well, it's just an assessment of a country's public debt. As I said, it can be done by civil society, an independent citizens audit. It can be done by a government. In the case of a governmental audit, it can be pursued or implemented by the creditor government, by the government itself, by the parliament, and it can involve CSO participation, but it can also be done by by the debtor and by the creditor country. We have examples of both. It allows us to have an analysis of why and how debt was contracted, under what conditions, for what purposes, how the finance projects were managed, what impacts this process had in terms of the actual projects that were financed or the management of those finances, of those loans and debts, the impact on the public finances, on the deficits, for instance, or the impact on the well-being of the population, including impacts on human rights. What can we expect from such a debt audit? What results can we have from such debt audits? Well, we can find actions in the debt management process that are actually illegal, contrary to the law, or contrary to due diligence, so bad practices, malpractices. But we can also find debts that can be identified as illegitimate debts. I won't enter into the definition of illegitimate debts. I'll leave that to Eric. But one of the main purposes of conducting a debt audit is actually identifying those illegitimate debts. It can also reveal and provide evidence of corruption. But it can also help us to identify good practices and actually redefine internal rules for future borrowing or future lending. So it can help us develop a proposal for responsible lending and borrowing by analyzing what's been done wrong or what's been done well in the process of indebtedness in our country. It can also help us promote or demand transparency, accountability, and good governance. It's an action of transparency if it's done by a government, but it's also an action of overseeing and controlling the government action if it's done by civil society. It can help us also construct a critical analysis, a critical narrative of the indebtedness process to be used supporting a country's interest, for instance, in a debt restructuring process, for requesting debt cancellation, for refinancing discussions, but even for support for debt repudiation. So it helps us build the narrative if we are aiming to tackle the debt situation or the debt process. And it can also help us engage between different members of the civil society, different organizations of the civil society, together with academics, both locally and international. So it can help us build a network of organizations to work on the debt issue. So the debt audit as an excuse for movement building, both, as I said, locally and internationally. And it can also help us link with the communities, link with the society. So we can do a very open process of debt audits, linking with the communities affected by those debts, by those projects financed by loans. What can be analyzed in a debt audit? Well, the methodologies and the processes are very diverse. That depends on what is your objective. But I'll just point out to some issues. The first is the process of accumulation of debt. We can analyze the circumstances surrounding the issuance of debt, of bonds, or the circumstances surrounding the contraction of a loan from a bank or a PPP project, a public-private partnership project. The nature and the relationship between the different contracting parties. So if there is an imbalance of power that shapes the financial relationships and the conditions of the loan, of the lending, and this is another issue we can look at, the terms of the contract, see if the financial conditions, if the interest rates, if the penalties, if the conditions in general are good conditions or are not so good. Also, for instance, if it's a tied loan, so it includes the obligation of contracting corporations from the lending country, for instance, that could be something to look at, the guarantees, the liabilities, if it includes conditionalities, like the ones with the on the loans from the IMF, and which conditionalities and the impact of those conditionalities. The second, this was all like, what is the process that initiated the debt? The second is the object of the lending. If the funds were used for a white elephant infrastructure, so a useless infrastructure, if the funds were misused or abused, the social, economic, gender, cultural, environmental impacts of the projects that were financed by those loans, the implications of the conditionalities attached to those loans, and another financial context that can help us understand the process. And also the impacts, and the third question, the third issue is the impacts of servicing those debts. When it comes to defining a debt audit, there's one question we need to answer, which is, what is the scope? What do we want to include in this audit? And we can decide on a process that is very comprehensive. So defining a long period of time, 1 decade, 2 decades, and say we are going to audit all the debt in the last 20 years. That could be one of the options. That has pros, for instance, that you have an overview of the whole process of indebtedness. So how did you get to this situation? But also has difficulties. And the first one is that it can take long, and it can be complex, and it can take long to get results from the process. So instead of a comprehensive analysis from the beginning, maybe we can start a process by defining different phases. We can say, okay, we will start by auditing these 2 projects or these 2 loans that we think are illegitimate or we think have an importance in the debt context in our country, and then we will follow with other ones. Or we can say we will start with the last 2 years and then we will go back. So we defined a process divided by different phases. So after each phase, we can have a result. We can publicize a report saying, well, this project has these difficulties or these problems or these illegitimacies attached to it. This would be, like, following my experience in the debt audit processes in Spain, my recommendation, because otherwise, yeah, you get involved in very long processes where not everyone who is involved is consistent throughout the process. It's very difficult to get a result at the end. It's very different if we're talking about a government audit. So if the government is involved in the audit and has resources to finance that audit, then maybe we can be more ambitious in what we want to audit for a start. But if it's a citizens audit, I would propose, or I would recommend, to start with small things like that white elephant or infrastructure or loan that you know that has irregularities or that is quantitatively more relevant, or that can help us more explain or build that narrative to tackle, to challenge debt, to help with debt cancellation, to help with debt repudiation, depending on what is our strategy. And since I'm running out of time, I'm gonna quickly say several steps that I would recommend when civil society groups would like to start a debt audit. The first is the creation of the debt audit committee. This committee can be very different depending on which countries, and it's very different depending on if it's an official audit or the citizens audit. But in the case of a citizens audit, we would recommend that it doesn't only include activists from the CSOs involved in the audit, but also academics, experts in different areas. And by experts, I'm not saying just financial or juridical experts, but also experts on social, cultural, environmental, gender impacts, other social movements, experts from the international civil society that can help throughout the process. So make this committee as diverse as possible, not very big, but diverse. This committee would define the scope of the audit, would define the phases, which projects to audit first, etc., etc. The second recommendation I would make is to start by identifying priorities and defining this roadmap for the audit. So maybe we need a short report, a short analysis of the in-depthness process. How did we get here, to identify where to start? The second is who is doing the audit, who is analyzing the project, who's analyzing the loans. It doesn't need to be the committee. You can set up small groups like subcommittees of people that can include experts that can help analyzing a concrete loan or a concrete project. That would also give you scope to include citizens, to include communities. If you are going to, I don't know, audit a project, a loan for an industry, for an infrastructure that has affected a community, you will have difficulties to engage that community for an overall debt audit, but you will have more possibilities to engage that community for the specific audit of that project. So let's set up sub-teams for each phase, for each small piece of the audit. That sub-team, again, can include civil society people, can include even members of government, that if you are in collaboration with the government, professional auditors, if you have the contacts, experts, And it's important to remember that experts are not only, and apologies for my colleagues here, white men, middle age. You can find experts as community activists, as grassroots activists that have a lot of expertise that can help in the audit process. 3 more issues. One is access to information that can derail a debt audit process. So you will have to find ways to access information through Freedom of Information Acts in your country, through collaborations from the government, through petitions to the lender, maybe, that can also be an option, through international institutions, even establishing anonymous mechanisms where officials can link governments to the debt audit. That actually happened to us in the debt audit platform in Catalonia, where I live, and we got details of the debt audit from our regional government, from someone inside the government who leaked those informations anonymously to us. That is also a way to reach information. And there are institutions and organizations, international organizations that can help you set up mechanisms to get that information safely. The communication, it's important to communicate the results of the audit. It's important to have a communication strategy that the results of the audit don't stay in the closed circle of people engaged by the audit. So the public, the people in your communities, in your countries actually know what are the results of this audit. After the audit, you can actually take legal actions if the audit was to find evidence of irregularities and illegalities. You can do a campaign with the results of the audit. You can also make recommendations with the lessons learned. So you can continue the work after you finish that analysis. And finally, the issue of resources. So depending on what kind of audit you make, you will need resources, economic resources. Maybe to finance someone who can dedicate time to that debt audit. You can do it voluntarily. And the voluntary participation of academics and CSO representatives, even from the international community, can help. But if you have resources, you might get more stable support for the process. Sometimes if you depend too much on the availability of volunteers, the process can suffer delays, can suffer from those irregularities. There are other difficulties and recommendations that we could make, but I'll leave that for the question and answer. And in the paper, we will share at the end of the week. You will find references from different experiences in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Norway, in Greece, in Spain, in Mozambique, Philippines, Argentina, and also manuals, handbooks on citizens' debt audits, but also on official debt audits, including the recommendations from the audit company, Deloitte, that helped with the Norwegian debt audit. So even if you get the report, the briefing, and you have any questions afterwards, please contact with me. I'll be very happy to answer any question regarding that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iolanda. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. But we're going to go straight on to Eric Toussaint to dive more into the topic of what is illegitimate debt and how do we identify them? Here you go, Eric.
Bonjour, bonjour à chacun et chacune.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure having been invited by Eurodad. Very often, the CADTM, the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt, if you have the time to activate the interpretation, we've skipped from English to French. Can I continue? Is everyone hearing the interpretation good?
Donc c'est un
Yes.
plaisir
Okay.
de répondre à une
As I
invitation
was saying,
d'Eurodad.
it
Ça
was
fait
a pleasure to be
depuis
invited
plus
by
de 20 ans
Eurodad. For more than
que
20
CADTM
years,
et Eurodad
CADTM and Eurodad have been collaborating
autour évidemment des questions de la dette.
around debt
On n'a pas
issues, of
toujours
course.
les mêmes
We
positions,
don't
mais on
always
a
share the
toujours
same
été
position,
capable
but we have
de
always,
développer
nevertheless, been
une
able
collaboration
to
tout à fait constructive.
enter into a very
Euh,
constructive and
Alors,
open
je vais parler
collaboration.
des,
So let me
effectivement, un
talk
peu
to you
de
about
définitions.
some definitions. I'd like to offer you
Grosso
some
modo, il y a
definitions.
4 types de dettes
In rough, there are 4
dont
different
on
types of
peut
debt,
remettre en cause le
and
paiement.
for which
Ce
the
sont des
debt
dettes qu'on peut
servicing could
considérer
be
comme
called into
illégitimes,
question. We have illegitimate
des
debt,
dettes odieuses,
we have
des
odious debt,
dettes illégales,
we have illegal
des dettes
debts,
insoutenables.
and unsustainable debts. These are
Une
the
des
4
4
types. One of these 4 types
caractérisations peut suffire pour remettre en cause le
is
paiement
sufficient
d'une telle
to
dette
call
et la
into question the
validité
servicing of the debt or the
des
validity
dettes
of
réclamées à un
a
pays
debt
ou à une
is
entité publique.
reclaimed from a
Il y a bien
country
sûr
or a
une dette peut
public
être à la fois
organization,
illégitime, odieuse,
but we can
illégale
also
ou
have
insoutenable.
debts that are all 4 at the
Une
same
des,
time, odious,
ça correspond
illegitimate,
à une
sustainable,
des 4
illegal. These,
caractéristiques qui
uh,
suffit
as I said, one
pour
of
remettre en
these
cause le paiement
features
de la dette.
is sufficient to
Bien
question the
sûr,
servicing of the
si
debt. But of
la
course,
dette
if
qui est réclamée
the
correspond
debt
aux 4 critères,
meets all 4 criteria,
illégitimité, odiosité,
illegitimate,
illégalité
odious,
et
illegal,
insoutenabilité,
and
a fortiori,
unsustainable,
il faut remettre
then
en cause son
it
paiement.
must
Qu'est-ce qu'une
be
dette
questioned without
illégitime?
any doubt.
Je
What
vais
is
donner des
illegitimate
définitions
debt?
extrêmement courtes
I will be giving you very
qui
short,
ne
brief
dépassent pas
definitions.
entre une vingtaine et une
Uh,
cinquantaine de mots.
it's around 20 to 50
Une
words
dette
for
illégitime,
each definition.
c'est une
Illegitimate
dette
debt
contractée pour
is a
favoriser
debt that is
les
incurred
intérêts
to
d'une
favor
minorité privilégiée.
interests of a small privileged minority.
Par exemple,
For
une dette
instance,
contractée
a debt
pour sauver des
taken
grands
on
actionnaires,
to
des grandes banques
rescue
qui ont
large
provoqué une crise
shareholders or
financière
large banks
dans
that
un
have
pays.
caused a financial crisis in a country,
Les dettes accumulées donc par
or
un État
debts that are accumulated by a
pour sauver
state
des
to
banquiers
bail out
est une dette
bankers.
qui peut être considérée
These
comme
are debts that
illégitime
can be
parce qu'elle a
considered
servi l'intérêt
illegitimate because
d'une
they are
minorité
serving the
déjà
interests of
privilégiée.
a minority
Une
of
dette odieuse, qu'est-ce que
privileged
c'est?
people. What
Une
is
dette
odious
odieuse
debt? Odious debt
correspond à une définition qui a
would
une histoire
be
liée à la
defined
doctrine
in a historical way. There is
juridique
a
internationale
legal
qui s'appelle la doctrine
international
de la dette
doctrine,
odieuse,
the
qui a
odious debt
été
doctrine, which
rédigée, cette doctrine,
was
en
drafted
1927,
in
donc il y a près d'un siècle, qui a été
1907,
rédigée,
19
élaborée
almost
par un juriste
1927, almost a
qui s'est
century ago. It
basé
was drafted by a legal
sur
expert who
tous les
um,
litiges qu'il a pu recenser entre la fin du
studied all of the
18e
court
siècle
cases
et
between the end
le
of the
moment où il a
18th
écrit son livre.
century and the moment
Donc
when
on va
he
dire entre la
drafted
Révolution
this
française
doctrine. So between
et
the French Revolution, we could say,
les
and
événements qui ont eu lieu au début
the
des années
events
20,
that started in the
notamment
early
ce qu'on a appelé l'affaire
1920s,
Tinoco au
especially
Costa Rica.
in
Et
Costa Rica.
selon cette doctrine, il y a
And
deux
according
critères
to
pour
this doctrine, there are
caractériser
2
une
criteria
dette
to
comme odieuse.
define debt as
Premier
odious
critère,
debt.
la
The
dette
first
a
criteria
été
is that
contractée,
when
accumulée
these debts are
contre
accumulated
l'intérêt de la population
against the
du
people's
territoire concerné.
interest, against the interests of the people
Deuxième
living in the
critère,
territory. The second criteria
les
for
créanciers
odious debt is when
ne
lenders
peuvent pas faire la preuve
cannot
qu'ils ne
prove
pouvaient pas savoir.
that they weren't able to know.
Certains ajoutent un troisième
And
critère.
some also
Et
add a
là,
third
je suis absolument
criteria.
formel. Ce
Um,
troisième critère ne
this
fait
third
absolument pas partie
criteria,
de la
which
doctrine de
doesn't
la dette odieuse
isn't part of
telle qu'elle a
the
été
odious
élaborée
debt
par
doctrine as it was
Alexander
drafted
Sachs
by Alexander
en
Sachs in
1927.
1927 is the third criteria, which some say is that we have to be able to prove that the population didn't give their consent, or that the regime taking on this debt is a despotic regime. However, according to Alexander Sachs, the nature of the government has nothing to do
10 minutes.
with characterizing debt. Sachs explicitly says that you could have a monarchy, you could have a republic, you could have people's government, it doesn't matter. If they contract debt that goes against the people's interests, and if you cannot prove that they weren't able to know, then the debt to be considered odious debt and therefore shouldn't be serviced. The third type of debt that we can serve to question the servicing of the debt is illegal debt. That is debt that is incurred without respecting the legal precepts, and it depends on the countries. They have different legislations on governing the way in which debt contracts have to be signed. The illegal aspect of debt could also be understood in a broader sense of international law, which I think is quite right. That is, if debt is contracted without respecting the human rights that are guaranteed in international conventions, then it could be considered illegal debt. The fourth criteria is sustainability of debt. The three definitions that I offered previously are ex ante definitions, meaning that during the definiteness process, when we say it's unsustainable, it's ex post, meaning it comes later. So you could have a debt that is legally contracted, but let's imagine a situation where a country, if they were to service this legal or legitimate debt, is not able to meet its fundamental obligations with its citizens, like ensuring their security, ensuring access to education, to health, etc., etc. So if servicing this debt makes it impossible for a government to guarantee its citizens' rights, their fundamental rights, vital rights, well, then the servicing of this debt should be cancelled. So if a country is put in a position where they have to choose between saving their population from the COVID pandemic and servicing its debt, well, they could say that debt is unsustainable, and they could appeal to force majeure and to fundamental changes in the circumstances for not servicing the debt. So these are the four types of debts which would allow for not servicing debt. Yolanda talked about audits. You can have audits that are done by the judiciary, like in the case of Argentina at the age of the 80s, 1990s, which led to a ruling of the Argentinian Federal Court in July 2000 in the Olmos versus the Argentinian military case. Olmos was an Argentine citizen who, at the end of the dictatorship, uh, brought a lawsuit against the military for illegal and anti-constitutional debt. And the judiciary carried out an audit of the debt, and they published the outcomes of their audit. Then you have audits that are commissioned by the parliament. The Brazilian parliament, for instance, in 2008 and 2009, established a parliamentary commission to audit its debt. And in that commission, we had our friend Maria Lucia Fattorelli, who's also a member of Dad and CADTM. In the case of Peru, it's also a audit process that was commissioned by the Congress after Fujimori's dictatorship. And then you have audits that are commissioned by an executive power. And the executive powers can engage citizens in this audit process or not. In the case of Ecuador, for instance, I participated in the audit of the Ecuadorian debt in 2007-2008. This did include the participation of citizens. In the case of Brazil, in 1930, for instance, under the presidency of Getulio Vargas, he carried out an audit with the decision of the president. 5 minutes, is that right? 5 minutes, yes? Okay. Okay, so as I was saying, in that case, in Brazil, it was an initiative coming from the executive branch, and the way in which the audit was carried out was very important. In the case of Ecuador, the Ecuadorian president at the time created a commission where there were 12 delegates from Ecuadorian social movements and 6 delegates from international debt campaign, 3 Europeans and 3 Latin Americans. There were 4 and 4 state bodies. So this was a commission which in its most part was composed of citizens, especially Equatorian citizens, men, women, indigenous people, which had been appointed by the different social movements, CONAE, the Confederation of Indigenous Movements, the feminist movement, the Jubilee 2000 movement in Guayaquil, and others. And then in those cases where it's not the executive branch that decides to carry out an audit, or a parliament, or the judiciary, you can have initiatives that emerge from citizens themselves. And Iolanda has talked about this quite largely. And we have a whole series of citizen audits that have been carried out in several different countries. And many of our organizations that are members of CADTM, Latindad, Eurodad, and others have participated in these citizen debt audits. So what do you do with the outcomes of these citizen audits? Well, this was a big discussion between Eurodad and CADTM. Do we try, or do we say that we should take the issue to a court of arbitration, an international court of arbitration, instead of the country's court, or should we say that unilateral state sovereign action should be taken to cancel or repudiate this debt? It's a sovereign unilateral act because there is no international tribunal that can deal with the outcomes of a citizen audit. So we had discussions in Eurodad and CADTM, but I think we all agreed that in absence of a court that can deal with these issues, it would be totally normal for a state, based on the outcomes of the audits and based on international law, should be able to decide to repudiate or unilaterally structure this debt. This is what Ecuador did in the year 2008 by suspending their debt servicing and imposing lenders during the suspension a proposal which they could either take it or leave it, of reselling to the Equatorian state the bonds with a 70% reduction. And I'll leave it at that to respect my allocated time, and I'll be delighted to answer questions. I participated in the audit of the Greek debt. I also participated in the debt audit in Paraguay. I can answer your questions, or say more about this, and Iolanda also participated in citizen audit, especially in Spain. So thank you very much for your invitation, and I would be delighted to answer any of your questions.
We covered a lot of ground in this short time. We don't have that many questions so far, but we have about 10 minutes or 15 minutes to answer them. So feel free, if you have some burning questions, then feel free to note them down. I'm going to start with the questions we already have. And the first one, I think I will direct to Iolanda. It is from an anonymous attendee. What methods have you found successful for finding out what loans were used for? And then you could also say a little bit about the second, or was it the third question while you're talking. It's from Colin McQuiston. Who governs debt? Is it only possible to act at national scale under national law, or is there recourse to international law? And after that, I will invite Eric to respond to some of those other questions.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, Eric, for the presentation. It was actually very difficult to summarize so much information in such a short time as well. On the methods, it depends obviously on what you're auditing. But if we're talking about a citizen's audit, it's very different from an official audit. In an official audit, you actually have access to the contracts, which makes everything very different. And then you can easily find what the loans were used for, easily if there's no corruption or abuse or maluse of bad use of those loans. But anyway, in citizens audit, we practice several methods, including, I don't know, in Madrid, for instance, the Citizens Audit platform set up a website where people, just neighbors, could add any information they had on several projects that we knew were financed with debt, for instance. It's just keep gathering information from the citizens, from your fellow neighbors. That's one method, and that was very useful to push for an official audit at the government. So that the municipal government after that actually did an official audit. In the present situation, where most of the debt is actually by issuing bonds in the financial markets, and therefore there is not a project or a destiny where the money is used for, one of the methods we did was analyze the fiscal policy. So what is the evolution of the budget during that period after the bonds were issued? What is the evolution of not only of the expenses, but also of the revenues, if there were any tax breaks, if there was any tax reform that actually benefited the elites, if there was any bank bailout, and compare those numbers of the increasing debt and a bank bailout. And then you actually have a narrative saying, look, we have the data, and that data is normally available and public. So that actually depends on what you're looking for, but there are very imaginative ways of doing the audit. We have colleagues that have been auditing the debt of the health system in Madrid, and they are actually trying to follow up which are the corporations that are benefiting from the privatization of the health system, and that is their debt audit in Madrid. It's following how this privatization after the indebtedness is going. On the issue of who governs debt, I think it's very important. It relates to what Eric was saying at the end. We don't have an international court. We don't have an international arbitration process. This is something we're at the Eurodad we're advocating for, this multilateral debt workout mechanism. For the moment, for bonds, what we have is that most of the bonds are issued under London or New York law. So it's the London or the New York law that actually governs that debt. And this is why we are also pushing for anti-vulture fund legislation in London and New York. It's not even the UK and the US, it's this small portion of financial centers who actually governs most of the world debt today. And the only possibility to act at the national scale is from the borrowing side is repudiation, or not paying, as Eric was saying, so challenging that. And from the creditor side is this pushing for legislation to protect that sovereign decision from a government in the global south to actually decide on what to do on their debt. I'll leave it there because I see there are many questions.
I wonder, Iolanda, in the kind of continuation of that, could you also just comment on this question of would it then be possible to suspend the debt service if debt incurred is against sustainable development?
I'll leave to Eric to answer on the issue of international law, but I think one of the things that you risk when you do that is that your creditors can actually sue you in those international courts in New York or in London, as it happened with Argentina. So it's important that we protect countries from these vulture funds. At the moment, there is a lot of non-protection if you do that.
Thank you. I'll hand it over to Eric. And I mean, there are a couple of questions here that kind of go together a little bit in spirit. One is what is the role of banks in the illegitimate role of illegitimate debts, and then perhaps also what are your thoughts about the debt transparency initiatives led by the international financial institutions such as the Institute of International Finance? Because the private creditors have been taking a more active role on this issue recently. And then I think you should also feel free to comment on the questions that Iolanda has addressed, especially the one on governance.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Oui, je vais prendre justement.
Okay, thanks. I will be answering to the question on possible solutions. So, along the lines of what Iolanda was saying, and based on my conclusion, government, for me, should take unilateral actions to stop servicing their debts, or as an urgent measure, they should find resources in the state budget to meet the basic urgent needs of the population, such as fighting against the pandemic and the social and economic effects of a multi-dimensional crisis, such as the crisis we are living today. The state have the right and the duty to impose a moratorium on debt servicing, whether it is legitimate or not. And then there's the issue of if a debt is illegitimate or illegal or odious, well, in those cases, it's not just about suspending debt servicing, they should cancel debt servicing, repudiate it. And this has to go through a unilateral debt restructuring process. I wrote in an article published 3 months ago that quite surprisingly, and it was very interesting, the European Union Court of Justice said Greece was right against the German creditors who were saying that the 2012 debt restructuring had harmed them and was illegal. And the European Court of Justice said the lenders, which were bank and associations, were wrong, saying no, the Greek state was in its right to restructure its debt unilaterally, and you, the lenders, cannot reclaim anything from the Greek state, and you cannot obtain compensation for your loss. So it's important to look into jurisprudence to find arguments that can be used for unilateral action. So this is a recent court decision in 2019 after several years of long proceedings in the court. So I want it to be clear. The state, if a state wants to cancel its debt or repudiate its debt, it doesn't have to go to a court of justice to ask to do this. They can decide not to service its debt, and in doing so, they are granting maximum protection to face the possible reaction of the lenders. I gave another example. I can give another example in Europe. Iceland in 2008, after its banking system went bankrupt, Iceland decided not to compensate the UK and the Netherlands, who had people who are affected by the collapse of the banking system. They bailed them out, and UK and the Netherlands asked Iceland to reimburse them for these 3 billion indemnities, and Iceland refused. The United Kingdom and the Netherlands were very upset. In the UK, in uh, the Times of Gordon Brown said it would put Iceland on the terrorist list, and they confiscated some goods of Iceland in the UK, but Iceland didn't have many assets in the UK. And in the end, the UK and the Netherlands went to a court of arbitration with Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. And in this court of arbitration told the creditors that there was no reason for Iceland to have to carry with the effects of the bankruptcy of a private bank, which didn't have any guarantees from the Icelandic state, and Iceland hadn't signed any agreements with the UK and the Netherlands. So you can have states in the north or states in the south, like in Ecuador, who can win the case against their creditors if they base their arguments on legal groundings. And banks obviously intervene in the debt accumulation process by giving direct loans, banking loans, but this is used less and less to countries who have a lot of debts, for instance, Russia. But in the countries of the global south, they don't hold many bank loans. But where banks do intervene is that they buy sovereign bonds in the city of London or New York. This isn't a direct relationship between the bank and the state. It's this typical relationship where a bank holds sovereign bonds. So that is how they indirectly participate. Then you have global institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or regional banks, which can be creditors. But in this case, they are public plenty. With regards to the World Bank initiative on the matter of transparency, I really don't believe in this. I think it's a PR relationship. The World Bank is a specialist in all aspects where they are criticized. They always try looking for an initiative that looks nice and good on paper, but if you look at the most polluting transnational corporations, if you go onto their website, you'll see that oil multinationals always include actions to protect the environment on their website. The World Bank does the same, and we mustn't trust the World Bank at all. And that's all from my side.
Thank you, Eric. We are nearing the end of the session, but I would like to still like to welcome May from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development to say something very short on the topic you mentioned up here. I think you have 2 minutes because we still want to take a 10-minute break so that we start more or less 10 minutes after 4.
Okay, so this is very short, Kjetil. Thank you for this opportunity. Just to add to the discussion that in certain circumstances, or in circumstances what we have in the South, the debt audits are as much about process as outcome. So sometimes in many situations, the process becomes more important, especially where there's political repression and information is inaccessible and powerful public officials are involved. So the process enables popular education and raising questions, linking with other movements such as education, gender, health movements, and of course, that expands impact, organizing among the youth and students, and so on. So, for example, in the Philippines, the campaigning itself led to recognition by Congress of suspicious debt projects, and they allocated a budget for further investigation. And also on illegitimate debts, I think it's also important to point out the illegitimacy of debt itself as an instrument for, from that perspective that's historical and looking at how this has progressed over the years and really led to a dependence and a debt trap that's very difficult today for countries of the South to get out of. Thank you.
Thank you, May. That was really good. I think we take a 10-minute break now. We will keep your questions and we will see if we can address them either through by writing in the next hour, or if we can take them up in the next Q&A session. So we will be back at 10 minutes past 4. In the intermission, I believe Ilaria is going to share some questions or answers or something, right?
Yes, thank you, Kjetil. I will share some polls now.
Wonderful. And I'll see you all in about 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. Are we back? I hope you all had a nice little break. And I see that we have also been joined by Jeong-Dae, which is fantastic. Welcome. I forgot to introduce myself at the very beginning of this. My name is Kjetil Abildsnes and I work for Norwegian Church Aid in Oslo. But I used to be an activist on debt and I also continue to work on debt. But now we are going to hear from Mr. Daniel Jeong-Dae of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. and you're going to talk on debt in Asia. You have a background from research into issues of fiscal space, SDG investment, resilience, and shocks and structural transformation. And Mr. Dali has also worked for the government of the Republic of Korea and has an MA from Tufts University and a PhD from the National Institute of Development Administration in Thailand. So this should be very interesting. You feel free to add anything. I know that you have a presentation and that you have 25 minutes. And if you prefer, I can let you know when you have 5 minutes left, if that's okay, or?
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah,
thank you.
Wonderful. All right.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I wish to thank the organizers for inviting ESCAP. For those who are less familiar, ESCAP is the United Nations Regional Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And again, let me first try to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen and hear me clearly?
We can, perfect.
Okay, that's great. So thank you again for inviting ESCAP. And I think it's great that you put together this Dead Wednesdays and also looking at several thematic issues, but also looking at the different parts of the world because they're all very different. And today, I'm glad to talk about Asia Pacific region. And those of you who are less familiar about this region, here are some basic facts. It's a very large and diverse region, accounts for more than half of the world population. But you know, aside from the Chinas and Indias, we also have very small Pacific island states, you know, some of which have populations less than 100,000 people. So it's a very diverse region. And so obviously the public debt dynamics also differs quite a bit. Overall, I would say that, you know, public debt vulnerabilities has been, I think we've been in a better position. Asia Pacific has been in a better position relative to Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America and Caribbean. We haven't had a major sovereign debt crisis in the last 20 years after the Asian financial crisis in the 90s. And that's partly because we learned our lessons then. But having said that, you know, it's a region facing large investment needs for achieving the sustainable development goals and for achieving climate action. So, you know, this debt issue is certainly relevant in the current COVID-19 context and going forward. So on that note, let me give you a little bit of a context of my presentation, because public debt is a very broad area, but I'll be speaking a little bit coming from this particular context. So, you know, COVID-19 also in Asia Pacific has had a very severe impact. And it's a region where we were already kind of not on track on the SDGs even before the pandemic. So, you know, this is exacerbating that and potentially also undermining resilience to future shocks. And going forward, of course, many countries, including here in Asia, will face fiscal pressures, but ESCAP is strongly encouraging countries to avoid premature fiscal consolidation and really safeguard SDG expenditures during these difficult times. And later you'll see our recent research, which shows that investing in social services, digital access, and green development could reap significant benefits, but it also have debt implications. And so we'll discuss a little bit about how to finance those increased needs. And last but not least, I'll be also talking about how international support is critical for the Asia-Pacific least developed countries, and also several small island states here in the region, including through targeted debt relief. So my presentation has two parts. First, I'll just talk a little bit more about the descriptive part, what debt looks like and what the dynamics looks like in Asia Pacific, and then turn to policy issues, primarily two things. One is international kind of assistance in the face of COVID, so debt-related assistance. And then secondly, in the context of debt, in the context of investing in SDGs and climate action. So a little bit more of the longer term issue. So first thing I want to highlight is, what you see, the line here is the government debt as a percentage of GDP. And this is an unweighted average for 40 plus Asia Pacific countries. And what you see is, starting from the 2000s in the MDG era, we've seen some debt decreasing, but then since the global financial crisis, debt levels increasing from successive shocks. The beginning of the MDG era, it was partly we're starting from a high base, partly because, if you recall, in the late 90s, we had the Asian financial crisis. So a couple of countries, including Indonesia, for instance, had to go through sovereign debt restructuring, and that financial crisis came at a huge fiscal cost. But during this strong years of economic growth, debt levels successively went down. But global financial crisis, and also we had the commodity price shocks, and then the recent COVID-19 crisis. So on average, we're seeing about 7 to 8 percentage point increase in public debt in Asia Pacific. But again, these dots indicate the debt ratios before the COVID-19 crisis. So that's on the horizontal axis. And then after, so these are projections for 2022. And what you see is, so if the dots are above this horizontal, the diagonal line, that means that countries will have higher debt. And almost all countries are now falling within this triangle. So they'll have higher debt ratios going forward. And for instance, of Fiji, for instance, in 2019, before the COVID-19, it had about a debt ratio of about 50% of GDP. But next year, we're forecasting maybe about 80%. So that's almost a 30 percentage point increase. We also see that for countries like Nepal on the lower range of debt, and also Sri Lanka on the higher range, and especially for Maldives. So some of these countries were more severely affected because they're very tourism reliant countries, and the lockdown and closing of borders had really a significant impact on their government revenues. Now let's talk a little bit about what are the drivers of debt, and there are two things I want to talk about. One is kind of the budgetary element, so the higher borrowing needs arising from the revenues and your expenditures. But then later on, I'll also talk about some of the more macroeconomic issues, how GDP growth, how the financial markets, in terms of how they affect your borrowing cost, also affect debt dynamics. So first, we can see, it's a similar graph, but looking at the government revenues, we can see that in the post-crisis, post-pandemic era, we'll see many countries have a lower revenue to GDP ratios. And that's particularly worrying for countries that were already starting with very low revenues. So in Asia, countries like Bangladesh collect, barely 10% of GDP in revenues. And I think the general rule of thumb is that you need at least 15% of GDP in government revenues in order to finance basic public services. So for those countries, further fall in revenues is particularly worrisome. At the same time, due to the pandemic, generally we've seen government expenditure to GDP ratios rise compared to the pre-pandemic era. But of course, as I'll come back to it later, this is, you have to keep in mind that I'm showing this as a percentage of GDP. So if there was a huge GDP contraction in these countries, the actual expenditures had not actually increased much. Now, if you put them together, you look at the budget balance and the primary budget balance. And basically countries falling in this triangle are countries that are now seeing much deeper deficits in the wake of the COVID-19. And here again, we see countries like Maldives and Fiji, but also interesting to see that there are some countries like Australia and Japan, which are fairly advanced economies, as well as China. So for these countries, we have to keep in mind that this budget balance for Fiji and Maldives, for instance, a lot of it is due to the collapse in revenues, tourism-related revenues. But for Australia, Japan, and China, which were relatively less affected by the pandemic, economically speaking, a lot of this additional deficit is actually coming from higher expenditures. So these are the countries with very strong domestic investor base. And those are the countries that are able to borrow at a relatively low cost. So these countries are really have strong fiscal support coming, and so we have to kind of make that distinction. Now, here we put together the fiscal response to COVID-19, the kind of the different fiscal packages put together. You might be aware that globally, there has been about $16 trillion. Now, out of that, the developing countries in Asia Pacific account for about $1.8 trillion, or that's equivalent to about 7% of GDP. And but again, you see a wide variation. For instance, the kind of the East and Northeast Asian countries led by China, there the weighted average, the GDP weighted average was more than 7% of GDP was kind of went to supporting this emergency health responses, cash transfers, loans and guarantees for small businesses and so on. But what you see here is that the least developed countries in Asia Pacific, we have 11 least developed countries as defined by the UN. And for them, average fiscal response was much smaller as a percentage of their GDP. And so as even in Southeast Asia, although as a whole, they were able to launch fairly large support. If you look at the poorest countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, it was much smaller. So, and similarly for the Pacific Island states. So we have to keep that in mind when we talk about the debt dynamics as well. Now, as I mentioned, it's not just about how much you spend or how much your revenues were affected, but it's also about the macroeconomic elements. And we're looking at the public debt relative to the country's total output. So in 2020, we saw a huge contraction in many economies in their GDP. So that means your denominator has contracted. So even if you don't have much additional debt, your debt ratio as a relatively to your GDP will be higher. And so this yellow line, so Pacific Island countries have seen some of the deepest contraction last year, followed by South Asia. We've seen led by countries like India, for instance. So here we see the total output contracting and debt ratios also rising. Now, this kind of rebound in growth is a bit misleading, and we highlighted this in our recent report that if you look at the level or the actual GDP trend, there are large permanent losses from this economic recession. And we calculate that a permanent loss of about 2.6 trillion for Asia Pacific. That's about 10% of their combined GDP. So that's gone. And if you think about that, that means that overall we have much smaller resources for development purposes, for instance, going forward. So that's really worrying. Now, The other aspect when we talk about debt dynamics, of course, is the borrowing cost, and that's very important. And especially during times of financial market stress, we see borrowing costs rise steeply, especially for developing countries. So what I have here is two graphs on the left, is one for the dollar debt market and another for the local currency debt market. So you might be aware that, following the Asian financial crisis in 1997, because previous to that, we had a lot of what we call the currency mismatch. So and that was a real that was a major reason for the crisis. So we've started developing local currency markets to reduce the exchange rate risk, for instance. So looking at these two markets, both were, and this is kind of the sovereign spread or yield since January last year. So we saw a sharp increase in March and April, but then that fell partly because of large global liquidity due to actions by major central banks. Even in the local currency debt markets, we still saw a sharp increase, partly because even if they are issued in local currency, a lot of that is held by non-residents. So still capital flows will affect the yields, and that picked up quite a bit before falling. So in terms of the dollar debt market, we see that the spreads are now slightly still higher than the pre-crisis period. In terms of the local currency markets, it's actually lower, and that's partly because of very unprecedented measures in several Asian countries by the central banks. And so many of them not only lower their policy rate, which makes financing easier, but also many for the first time actually started directly purchasing government bonds. And so that really helped lower the borrowing costs. But having said that, I want to say that the borrowing cost differs significantly among countries, and that reflects their different sovereign credit ratings standings. So this is an index based on the credit ratings of the major three rating agencies. And so about half of the countries have investment grade, and the rest non-investment grade. So countries in the non-investment grade, like Pakistan, Mongolia, Cambodia, these countries have seen much higher spikes in their borrowing cost. And this is a pre-crisis level, but during the since last year, we've seen, I think, globally about 46 sovereign credit downgrades. So 46 countries facing downgrades. In Asia, about 1 out of 4 countries face downgrades, including countries like Maldives and Sri Lanka. So they face higher borrowing costs. That's still slightly better than Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa, where I think more than 1/3, 1 out of 3 countries face downgrades. But still, this is a significant issue. And just as a side note, especially countries that had weaker ratings, another issue is, aside from the borrowing cost, a lot of the kind of the new bonds they issued since last year are very short-term maturity because they didn't have very strong investor confidence, so they couldn't really issue very long-term maturity. So even if they were able to issue bonds at some decent interest rate, that came at increased refinancing risk down the road. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you put these together, this is from a recent policy brief I put together. So what this shows is for Maldives, for instance, and in the brief, you can see it also for other countries. You can really break down the debt dynamics into the major drivers. So the orange part is, how much the primary balance, so your additional spending, relative to your revenues, is really driving higher debt. Whereas the gray part is what we call the interest growth differential, and that usually, if your interest rate borrowing cost is lower than your GDP, nominal GDP growth, that tends to lower government debt. So basically, if you have very favorable economic growth and borrowing cost dynamics, even if you have fiscal deficits every year, your debt ratios might not go up or even decline. And then the opposite is true, of course. So for Maldives, for instance, in 2020, we saw a huge increase in debt of more than 40 percentage points of GDP. And part of that was driven by the collapsed revenues and therefore the fiscal deficit, but also a direct result of the GDP contraction and higher borrowing cost. And this chart is important because, for instance, this calculation, I did it based on the IMF forecast. And what we see also is in the coming years, the projections of debt and the assumptions behind it, you can see that, for instance, for Maldives, from very high debt levels, we see slight decrease down the road, but that will be driven, that's kind of based on relatively favorable growth and borrowing cost assumptions, and also kind of fiscal adjustments, your budget adjustments. So obviously we don't expect much boost in revenues in the near term. That means a lot of that adjustments will have to take place through the expenditure side. So that's also quite worrying. Now, just briefly, before I go on to policy issues, aside from the debt levels, so the debt ratio could be 60% of GDP or 80%, that's important, but the debt structure is also equally important when we talk about debt vulnerability. So the currency denomination, the investor base, the domestic and foreign investor base, the maturity profile, and so on. So I just want to point here some data showing that some countries might be more vulnerable to exchange rate risks or refinancing risks, for instance. And on the external debt side, we also want to look carefully at the creditor landscape. And here we show Asia Pacific countries in two groups. One, countries that are eligible for what we call the DSSI, or the Debt Service Suspension Initiative by the G20. So these are mostly least developed countries and other vulnerable countries, and kind of the countries in a better kind of a fiscal position in general. And what you see is, typically the DSSI countries, they rely a lot more on the bilateral official creditors. About half of their external debt is held by, official bilateral creditors. Whereas in the non-DSSI countries, about half is held by private creditors. So this is important to know because now when we turn to the policy issues, just one thing quickly to point out is even among the DSSI eligible countries in Asia Pacific, you can see that some countries actually rely heavily on private creditors. And this is like Mongolia, for instance. So when we recently had a dialogue with them on why they were eligible for DSSI, but nevertheless not participated, I think one of the reasons was because for them, the private creditors are very important, and they didn't want to risk any credit downgrade by participating in this official bilateral debt rescheduling. So this is a good place for me to turn to policy issues, and I'll try to move quickly here. Yeah. So
5 minutes.
Okay, I'll move very quickly. Sorry, I started a little slowly. So some breathing space from the SSI. And so in Asia, we had about 24 countries that are eligible, but only 10 decided to participate. And as I mentioned, some of that was due to credit rating concerns, but also, DSSI is basically a liquidity provision. It's a rescheduling of debt, not debt relief per se. So countries like Pakistan, when we talk to them, they seem to have really benefited from DSSI because they had a lot of maturing loans, maturing debt, in the next year or so. So for them, they had a lot of debt to pay back now, and so DSSI really provided breathing space. But when we talk to Kyrgyzstan, which did not participate, they said they have a lot of debt due in the next few years. So for them, rescheduling and delaying it now will put additional pressure later. So that was one of the reasons they didn't participate. Now, just multilateral support was another thing. Now this is additional loans, so this will add to your debt, but they mostly came at concessional terms from World Bank, ADB, and major other IFIs. So we can see that, especially for a lot of the smaller Asia Pacific countries, it was fairly a significant boost. But one thing we point out is that given that countries still had to pay back their multilateral debt during the same period, the actual net inflows was actually quite small. So a lot more needs to be done. And the recent policy brief by the UN Secretary General highlights several issues here, what we can do. So among them include some new liquidity measures. So you might be aware there's a new SDR allocation coming up. So about equivalent to about $650 billion. And developing Asia Pacific countries will take about 140 billion out of that, we estimate. The policy brief also calls for credit enhancement measures or measures aimed at lowering the borrowing cost of developing countries. Also, some solvency issues. So really targeted debt relief, including through debt swaps for SDGs or for climate, for countries that are most vulnerable. Also, some talks about the role of credit rating agencies given their influence on the borrowing cost. Now, this is all very important because, if you just focus at the liquidity measures, that kind of assumes that things will get better quite soon. But our recent analysis research shows that actually, if you look at all the past shocks, including past pandemics, they tend to have very persistent effects. So we're not going to rebound quickly. And so we need really sustained support from the international community. And this is an UNESCAP tracking of SDG progress of Asia Pacific countries. So what this shows is that even before the pandemic, we were already lagging behind on many SDGs. So in order to really accelerate progress, including through additional investments, and we've estimated additional investment needs in our recent research, we really need a lot of international support, especially for the poorest countries. So in our most recent research, what we did was to propose building for a better policy package consisting of social services, digital access, and green development measures. And so a lot of additional investments combined with some tax and subsidy reforms, carbon tax and fuel subsidy phasing out. And what we see here is that this additional investments could have really major gains. So about 180 million people lifted out of poverty in the long run, and carbon emissions falling sharply from these measures. But they also come with additional pressure on public debt. So for Asia Pacific, developing countries as a whole, we see about an increase of 20 percentage points compared to the baseline by 2030. That's relatively manageable. But for the least developed countries in the region, because of their large development gaps and investment needs, it's going to be a much steeper price tag that we see. So this turns me to conclude with a few policy options for these countries. So for the least developed countries, it's essential they actively engage in debt relief measures, including debt swaps. And especially for some of the smaller countries that have very small domestic investor base, offshore public bonds and diaspora bonds could also be an option. Also, they want to incorporate catastrophic risk to fiscal planning to kind of prevent large fiscal costs down the road. And Asia is very interesting because compared to Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, the region has many debtor countries, but also major creditor countries like China, and to a lesser extent, Japan and India, especially for its immediate neighbors. So those countries could also consider debt restructuring, granting debt restructuring to their neighbors. All countries have to pay more attention to debt management strategies, given that overall debt stocks are higher now, the stakes are higher. Emergency financing mechanisms, and exploring thematic bonds like green bonds, sustainability bonds can really help them not only raise additional funding, but also channel them to the right places. So I'll just finish with the slide that I started with. Going forward, even in Asia Pacific, which as a whole was relatively less scathed by the COVID-19 pandemic compared to Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, for instance, we see a smaller fiscal space. So we'll have to be very strategic and make sure that our recovery packages are well aligned with the 2030 agenda. And when we do that, as we've shown through our Building Forward Better package, we'll also have to pay attention to the fiscal implications of that, especially for the least developed countries that might face the largest public debt pressure. And we've talked about the need for increased international support for those countries. Thank you very much. I encourage all of you to visit our report, which contains a lot more details. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions. I'll pause share, and you could, if the organizers could also bring down my screen. Let me try to also do it from my side. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That was a really comprehensive and very good introduction to debt in Asia. I haven't seen many questions so far. There's one question. Are you seeing the questions, Daniel? You can see them if you press the Q&A, but there's one question which is kind of on the side of this topic, which is microcredit finance debt issue in Sri Lanka. So I will encourage, if anyone has input to that question, if there is a successful struggle against microfinance agents by community in the South, then please answer that in the chat, or in the type an answer, or but I'm still waiting for questions. So if any of the other presenters wants to ask questions of Daniel, please do so. I will kind of try to, because some of the things that I find interesting as a kind of former campaigner, and like you mentioned small island states, and they have gotten quite a lot of attention in recent years on debt issues in general. Are there any of those that, I mean, you didn't specifically single any countries out as being in debt distress or having an issue, but can you say something? Are we expecting to see countries falling into a debt crisis in Asia in the next couple of years?
Thank you. That's a very pertinent question, and yeah, I wish I had highlighted that a bit more. One of my slides had shown the countries at different levels of debt risk, and first of all, in Asia Pacific, we didn't have any countries already in debt distress compared to other regions before COVID, but we had about 11 countries that were in high risk of debt distress, and out of those 11, 8 were small island states in the Pacific. So you can see that they're much more vulnerable, and even before COVID and even during COVID, for instance, they're suffering from large natural disasters, climate-related disasters that usually, wipe out a huge portion of their GDP and results in huge fiscal costs. So, in fact, we recently had a policy dialogue with Pacific Island countries, and one thing that I think the Pacific economic ministers are considering now is this climate debt for climate swaps, because these are the countries that are now seeing huge debt burdens partly because the borders are shut down and their tourism industry is dying, and it doesn't really make sense for them to tell them to you have higher debt but cut down on your climate resilience investments, for instance. So for these countries, debt swaps for climate will be very effective in the sense that donors will be able to make sure that the savings from debt relief are channeled to the climate resilience investments that are needed. And another thing, if I were to add, that was interesting was that in the Pacific Islands, they have something called the Pacific Resilience Facility that was set up even before the pandemic. So usually for debt swaps, one challenges the high transaction or monitoring cost, to make sure that the money goes to the right projects. But given that they already have this investment facility, I think if you can link that with the debt swaps, I think we have a very good, ready to go kind of a mechanism.
Thank you. I mean, before you joined us, we were talking about illegitimate debt and odious debts. And I know that from the discussions we've had in the past, when you're talking about debt swaps, it's important which debts are being swapped and how, and the conditions for that. Do you have any advice on these topics, or is this something you're considering?
Yeah, on illegitimate debt, yeah, that's a topic I didn't touch, and I think the previous speaker touched on it a lot. But I think right now in my presentation, I didn't really talk about how that debt was initially accumulated, for instance, and whether that came from a lot of corruption or kind of large military expenditures, for instance. So that's an aspect that we can also look at. But when we're talking about debt swaps, I think we're looking in general at countries, for whatever reason, have very high debt and they're so close to insolvent. So they're facing not just a liquidity issue, but they have solvency issues. So there, I think we do need targeted debt relief. And but again, the advantage of debt swaps is you want to make sure that any savings from debt relief goes to the right places.
And now I see that we have some questions coming in. So if you see the Q&A, you can read them, but I'm gonna read them out so that that we get them, that everyone hears them too. We have first the question is, what is a diaspora bond? Is that, I don't think you touched, did you touch on that? But if you know, then please. But first, maybe comment on the cycle between the fear of downgrade by countries and the fact that they would not be taking part in debt restructuring initiatives like the SSI. Often countries will fear to kind of say that they're in default, that they cannot fulfill their commitments. And how do you tackle that? And also there's a question of how does the private creditors in Asia and the Pacific compare to other regions?
Thank you for those questions. I'll try to address them one by one. Starting with the DSSI. So as I mentioned, just a few weeks ago, we had a consultation with finance ministers of Pakistan and Maldives, and senior also finance officials from Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, and a few other countries. And the reason was we wanted to get a sense of whether they find current initiatives like DSSI suitable or adequate, and whether there are any concerns like the ones you mentioned, like the credit downgrades. So again, I mentioned that for some countries like Pakistan, which had a lot of debt payments coming up very quickly, they still found it very useful, this kind of a temporary relief suspension. But many other countries said that this debt rescheduling was very small, and so the potential benefits were very, very low, but potential costs were high in the sense that it could potentially send the wrong message to the credit rating agencies, or at least the investors might kind of misperceive. So in case of Maldives, especially, it had already gone through a credit downgrade, and they were trying to, convince investors that, the situation on the ground was actually much better than what the credit rating agencies were saying. So for them, I think they saw a lot of risks there. And also for Mongolia, which is also eligible for DSSI but did not participate. I think one of the reasons was because they wanted to make sure that they continue to have access to the capital markets, and they were concerned that engaging with this official bilateral creditors and rescheduling might send the wrong signal. So this is a real issue, and so I think that's one of the reasons why the UN, in the UN, there's a discussion on the role of credit rating agencies and how they should not only look at the short-term macro stability, but also the long-term kind of a strength of the economy, because a lot of the borrowing might be invested in the right places, and in the longer run, that could strengthen the debt dynamics as well. So there's some ongoing discussion on that. On the private creditor participation, I don't have a very clear picture. As I said, in terms of the official creditors in Asia, a lot of the debt is, the major creditors include China. So there is a lot of scope for regional cooperation. But in terms of the private creditors, which typically includes commercial banks, bondholders, and others, I think it's much more widespread globally. And I think in the coming months, we are hoping to have more dialogue also on private creditor issues, just like some other UN regional commissions like in Africa has done. On the issue of diaspora bonds, it's simply kind of leveraging your migrant workers abroad and the remittances they're sending back home, which are typically channeled to households, but there are some also new initiatives to kind of turn those inflows into investments, because they're fairly large inflows that could also contribute to broader development goals.
Thank you. We have gotten quite a few questions, and we're going to continue for some more minutes, if that's okay. One is in continuation of what you said about debt relief and not wanting to accept it. There's a question that from Iolanda saying, I wanted to know your opinion on the reluctance of Asian countries to participate in debt relief initiatives that are linked to IMF programs due to international reputational risk, and the risk of asking for IMF support. And then also from Miriam van der Stikkele, debt swaps still need high debt while there is less budget to repay it. What about requiring that private creditors that bought bonds at very high interest rates and low credit ratings because of risks to assume their risk and reduce the debt burden? Is there part, is in the swaps, is there a discount? I guess there might be. And finally, adding to the IMF question, it would be interesting to hear if there are things that the Paris Club and creditors, I guess, in the West, if we were to put it like that, can learn from how debts are being handled in Asia.
Okay, thank you. So let me try to recall and answer those questions. First of all, about any stigma from IMF programs. So you might be aware, following the SSI, the more recent development is what we call the G20 Common Framework for targeted debt relief for the same group of countries. And there, a precondition is that if you want to participate in that kind of targeted debt relief program, you have to be in an IMF program. And so even in our discussions with some countries, I think that was a major concern, because going to the IMF does have stigma. And in Asia, we know that very well because that happened during the Asian financial crisis. And so I think that's still one reason why many countries are reluctant. So in fact, so there might be also some other ways. I think when we were talking to the Pakistani officials, one of their suggestions to bypass this stigma issue was to not make this like a debt rescheduling or debt relief per se, but just provide additional finance on very concessional terms. Because then that would kind of bypass some of the stigma issues, although there's some slightly different dynamics there. So kind of providing that money through some other channels rather than what we call debt rescheduling or debt relief might also be there. On the private creditors and debt buyback, I think you're referring to debt buyback. I didn't really fully understand the question, but the idea is to, in debt swaps, that can apply to official creditors, but also private creditors. So if with some funding from the international community, we can kind of buy back the debt that's held by private creditors, and ideally at a discount because of the current situation. Then that could kind of be a way to bypass the issue of creditor coordination among very many private creditors, and it could be a potentially faster way to also absorb that part of the debt profile. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what. I don't think there has been much discussion on that in the Asia Pacific context, at least. So that we'll have to look more, and again, I think we'll have more dialogues, regional dialogues in the coming months along those lines as well. So because private creditors are a major part of the creditor landscape in Asia Pacific, including for some of the more least developed and landlocked countries. There was one more question. I am trying to recall what that was on.
Well, it was more of a. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about getting Asian countries involved in the Paris Club and the debt negotiation and the way that debt is resolved. And so I just wanted you to reflect on that. And then there's also a final question in the Q&A on, if you have time and it's on the tip of your tongue, elaborate on the debt situation in Bhutan and their different position on coping mechanisms.
In Bhutan?
Yeah, Bhutan.
Okay.
But if you know it, if not, we can follow up with
sure.
that individual.
Sure. On the Paris Club, basically it's a club of creditors, as you're aware, but because the creditor landscape has changed significantly, China is now kind of a major creditor globally, and including in Asia Pacific region. So I think there's been more efforts to, for instance, the recent G20 common framework is an effort to kind of harmonize their practices. I think there are some recent studies that look at China's past debt relief activities as compared to the Paris Club debt relief activities. There are some differences. I think in the past, at least, Chinese debt reliefs was quite active, but relatively small in scale in most cases. We've also seen some slightly new elements in the Chinese lending schemes. Sometimes they accompany large collaterals. So if a country is unable to repay their debt, China would sometimes, take over some of the assets that kind of came through those borrowing. So some of that also sometimes makes things more complicated. So I think that's one of the reasons why in ESCAP we're also trying to explore more regional dialogue to kind of get a sense of what are these different practices, how they have been, and give in the past, there were some small restructuring here and there, but nothing like this. Going forward, we're seeing this was a much more synchronized and deeper shock. So I think there is a really need for increased dialogue and going forward. On Bhutan, I haven't seen I'm not sure which question it is, but one thing I can mention is, Bhutan's debt level is relatively high, partly because of its hydropower kind of sector. So it's relatively high, but it's not necessarily posing a lot of risk per se. And in fact, ESCAP has recently worked closely with Bhutan so that they were able to issue their first sovereign bond in international capital market to kind of also finance their COVID-19 response. So, one thing we have to consider is that, even during this pandemic, sure, there are, heightened debt vulnerabilities and concerns, but also countries need to issue debt bonds. And so helping countries, especially small countries like Bhutan, to issue sovereign debt successfully, I think it's also a very important task to kind of them to tap to the right investors and come up with a reasonable maturity profile and borrowing cost. I think that's also very important, and that's something we saw with Bhutan recently.
Thank you so much. We are already 1 minute over time. So I want to thank you, Daniel, for a very good presentation and very good answers. Very present. It's been the questions just at the very end there. They just came like an avalanche, which was great. So you definitely tickled some brains. We are sadly out of time. I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank the speakers, Daniel, Eric, and Iolanda. And I want to thank the donors, European Union, Bread for the World, Open Society Foundations, and Avena Americas. And then I also am tasked with reminding you all about the next Debt Wednesdays, where the topic will be IFA reform, debt workout mechanism, and responsible lending and borrowing. Overview of, and then also the overview of debt in Europe. So this is where we will dig deeper into how we can change or what should happen with the international debt architecture and system. So looking forward to that. Don't miss it. Do you want to add anything, Ilaria, before we let people go?
I know it's already very late, so I'll keep it short. Thank you, Kjetil. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just a quick reminder that at Eurodad we updated our communication system. So as many of you already saw, in order to participate to all the Debt Wednesdays event, you would have need either to reconfirm with the email that I sent you a few days ago, or either register again. I put the link in the chat here, but probably if you're here, you already did it, so nothing else to add. Thank you very much.
Bye all, and take care and be safe wherever you are. All the best.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.